DJ Mike C on the track.
Cause that be natural.
Lady D.
I ain't looking tacky. I keep my game tactful.
Yo,
yeah, I'm so nappy. Cause that be natural.
The infamous.
I ain't looking tacky. Cause I keep my game tactful.
I'm so pretty, I'm so fabu, I'm so natural, it's like it's a taboo. I'm so filthy, got the tattoo, fucking these bitches like I own ragu. On my business with my platoon, getting these minutes like I'm a typhoon. Y'all is cheering on that cartoon. Hey guys, and welcome back to Afros and Baby Hairs, and thank you for joining me in the reading room for book review number 31, and that is on the Cartel Queen, Aries Manifesto by Jaquavis Coleman. So, if you are interested in hearing details as well as my thoughts and opinions on this book, then please keep on watching. Now, I am not and I do not promote or encourage anyone to read this book who is under the age of 18. If you are under the age of 18, please get your parents' consent and or supervision before reading this book. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's get into this book review. So I'm going to start off by reading the back of the book. On the beautiful island of Anguilla, a woman with a checkered past has retired from a life of crime. She is now raising her son, trying to spare him of the ills that her former life provided. However, in a blink of an eye, it all changes. When a wealthy tourist gets entangled with her son, it forces Aries to show who she really is, and her old connections are called. This smart, slow burn island thriller brings out the devil that one knows but will surely find out about. The mental chess game played leads up to a unique ending no one can see coming. Next, I'm going to tell you about the characters. I think I have all of them, but I just want to briefly let you know who these characters are. So Aries is one half of Murder Mamas, and she's a Cartel affiliate, and she's also Trey's mom. Saint is the local plug, and he's a club owner, and it's for teens and and tourists that come into town like as spring breakers. And Aries is his love interest. Crow is Saint's lieutenant and head of the Murder of Crows, also Jalen's brother. Trey is Aries' son. Jalen is Crow's little brother and Trey's best friend. Lovey is Saint's grandmother. Flower, aka Detective Melissa Wade, is an undercover agent acting as a mute and mentally challenged child. Mia Moore is the other half of Murder Mamas. She is Carter's wife and also CJ's mother. CJ is Mia Moore's son and a Cartel member. Jupe is Saint's 12-year-old protege turned hitman. Sheriff Gibson is a native to the islands, and we'll just call him or say that he's a vault cop. The accountant, which is Saint's accountant, is a middle-aged white man. Tammy, aka Red, is a waitress at Jimmy's, and she's also Aries and Saint's sneaky link. There was also a Latina chick that Red was affiliated with. I will just say she's Red's companion. Jimmy is a bar owner. Chubbs is one of the Murder of Crows. Oh, Spark is a local sewer rat. George Diaz, aka Diaz, is the new plug responsible for all of the expansion. Christina Diaz is Diaz's only child, and she's Crow's sneaky link. Detective Watson is an FBI agent. Detective Vasquez is his partner, who is a FBI agent as well. Tom is head of security for Diaz's resort. And the murder of Crows is all of Crow's goons. And Lewis is Diaz's nephew. So the prologue is basically the end of the story, which is 5 years back in Barbados, or Bridgetown, Barbados. And apparently Aries is having a nightmare and is feeling guilt because she just aborted a child. During the dream, she is holding a baby over a 32-story building while crying, and suddenly she lets go. The baby obviously looks exactly like Aries, And once she lets the baby go, of course, the baby cries, and then the cries turn into an alarm clock buzzing and wakes Aries up out of the nightmare. Aries is in excruciating pain and proceeds to take her meds that the doctors prescribed for her after the abortion. She goes into the kitchen where she is greeted by CJ and Miamore, who are there to pay their respects as well as to handle business. The next part of the prologue is about Saint, who was a drug kingpin who had relocated his only living relative, his grandmother Lovey, back to her homeland there in Barbados. He had brought her a nice villa there, and they both were in a loving, happy state, both being best friends and both living the life that they desired. Lovey, his grandmother, wanted to spend her remaining days in her homeland, while Saint needed to get away from all the things he had going on in the States. Anyway, this particular morning, Saint wakes up to the smell of burning breakfast, but just thinks it's normal for his grandmother to burn food while getting consumed by her favorite TV shows. But as he makes his way to the kitchen after calling her a couple times with no answer, he notices a lot of smoke. The food is burning and the smoke detector is beeping, and his grandma is nowhere to be found. After putting the burning pots in the sink and running water over them, Saint discovers that he has stepped into something wet and finds out it's actually blood. Then he finds his grandma's headless body. Shaking and in shock, he calls out for his personal gunman, Jude, and goes to look for him and finds his headless body in the living room. After a few moments, he discovers both his grandma's and Jupe's head on platters in the china cabinet and realizes this was his karma. Now, chapter 1 takes place a year earlier. The setting is at a club called The Wave that is designated for spring breakers and high school students that are native to Barbados. There is also an aura of heavy drug use. In this chapter, we meet a 15-year-old boy by the name of Trey, who is a computer genius, and his friend Jalen, who is a 15-year-old as well. They attend the same school and have become good friends. Although Jalen is a wannabe bad boy and is the younger brother of Crow, who is the leader of the Murder of Crows, which is a gang of 18-year-olds and younger misfits, dropouts, and savages. Jalen brought Trey to the Wave on this particular night to introduce him to his brother, Crow, because he feels that Trey will be an asset to the Crows because of his skill set. Also, Jalen wants to be a part of the Crows, and he sees this as a way in. However, for whatever reason, Crow really doesn't take his little brother seriously for whatever reason. Anyway, Jalen finally leads Trey to the back of the club where only the Crows congregate and handle business. Naked girls are snorting drugs, and Crow and his crew have a white boy tied up in a chair that looks as if he's been beaten. Trey sees Crow for the first time after hearing so many horrible things about him, and he definitely got what he was expecting, a whole monster. Crow is described as a very dark-skinned, almost purple skin-toned, hairless, well-built man with menacing gray eyes and a gold grill. At this particular moment, Crow is trying to get the white boy to give him the code to his cell phone so that he can access his account to transfer all of his money to himself. However, the white boy doesn't seem to be budging even after being beaten up. So this is where Trey's skill come into play. Trey is terrified witnessing this white boy being held against his will and getting tortured. It also seems as if Jalen is a bit scared too. But Crow tells Trey to open the cell phone, which Trey successfully breaks into, and then he was told to go to the Cash App and transfer the funds to Crow's Cash App account. And that's when Trey has to speak up and tell Crow that that's the easiest way to be traced. By speaking up, Trey angered Crow and the Crows. So Trey started explaining about Bitcoin, and ultimately Crow tells Trey to send the money to himself, then transfer it to him via Bitcoin, because Crow really didn't understand how Bitcoin worked. However, Trey did what he was told. The whole time, Jalen was boasting and bragging on Trey's skills. The funds were successfully moved and Crow released the white boy. He gave Trey pound but ignored his little brother. Chapter 2 takes place at Aries' restaurant called Robin's, named after her sister. Also, this is Aries' home on the beach. She is waiting tables and some 15-year-old boys on the beach. Obviously, they're in Barbados on vacation. Recognize her from the YouTube documentaries they had seen on her back in the States. At first, they weren't for sure, but after she caught them staring at her, she showed them her MM tattoo on her wrist, and the boys took off running. After that, we meet Flower, a girl who was mute and mentally challenged. And she was basically abandoned on the island, and the community basically took her in. Aries fed her daily. The sheriff let her sleep in one of the cells at night, and some of the townspeople donate her clothes and whatnot to her from local boutiques. However, Flower spends most of her time with Aries at the restaurant, and she always brings flowers to Aries, and she gives flowers to all of the guests, and that's how she got the name Flower. No one knows her real name because Flower is mute, nor has she been able to tell anyone anything about where she comes from or who she belongs to, or how she ended up on the island. We learn also that Trey is Aries' son. He is responsible for helping his mom at the restaurant, which really doesn't give him time for much of a social life because him and his mom are the only two employees. So now that he's getting older, seems like a little bit of resentment is setting in. Anyway, on this particular day, an unfamiliar face shows up, whom is a man, and right off Aries knows he is not a tourist because he wasn't falling out drunk upon entering her establishment. He also had a nice tan, which to her means he is a local. He didn't look up from his phone at first and didn't look at the menu. However, I already knew what he wanted to order. Aries explained to him that they didn't have a website, so there was no way for him to know what was on the menu. And she instantly knew he was up to something. She constantly asked him why was he there, and when he finally looked up, he noticed how beautiful she was and told her his name was Saint, and that he was there to do business with her. He basically wanted her to wash his money and earn a commission of $50,000 per month. Aries thought dude was nice looking with his pot belly and all. She also noticed he had a nice row of top teeth with the bottom row of golds. She still didn't want to do business with him because she didn't know if he was the feds, someone from her past, or if he really needed his money washed. She also has enough money stashed of her own, and what he was offering was merely pennies. She basically told him that she wasn't interested in and proceeded to close her business for the day. He was left stuck on stupid, yet intrigued as to why she turned down the offer. Chapter 3 takes place at Saint's villa, where we get to meet Levy. She is cooking breakfast for Saint while singing along and blasting Anita Baker. She doesn't know that Saint is standing there watching her, and once she sees him, she's startled. Saint notices Crow sitting outside, still from working as Saint's personal gunman, securing the house on third shift. He questions his grandmother as to why she didn't invite Crow in, and she expresses how she dislikes Crow and doesn't trust him, pretty much says that he is the devil. After Saint finished his breakfast, he went outside to ask Crow about the incident that happened at the Wave with the white boy, and told Crow to stop with all the drugs and the childish antics before he destroyed Saint's entire operation. He also asked Crow what he knew about Aries, which wasn't much. However, Saint wanted to try to intimidate Aries into giving in to his proposition. So he told Crow to get his crew together and go shake up things at Aries' spot. He made sure Crow understood not to go too far. Later, Crow and his crew goes and tears up Aries' restaurant. Then Trey jumps to defend his family but gets pushed to the floor. Then looks at Crow in confusion. At that moment, Crow realizes that Trey is Aries' son. Also, Aries scratches up one of Crow's members' faces until it bleeds. She also pulled out her 22 on Crow because the old Aries kicked in after seeing her son being slung to the floor. She asked Crow who sent him, and he tells her that Saint wanted her to consider the offer. She told him that she had a message for Saint as well, but she will relay that to him in person. After they left, she helped Trey off the floor and noticed how shocked and afraid Flower was, and noticed that she had soiled herself during the chaos. Chapter 4, Saint woke up to the smell of his grandmother cooking breakfast and playing music as usual. However, this particular morning he heard laughing, which was unusual because it meant that someone was visiting. When Saint made his way to the kitchen, he saw Aries talking to Lovey and sitting comfortable and calm. Lovey was giving off vibes that she was under the impression that Saint and Aries had spent the night together. Saint was confused. Saint was confused as to how Aries got past Crow and what was she doing there. Basically, Aries came by to show him that he doesn't know who he's messing with and to never come mess with her and her family again if he didn't want his family to be touched. So she also pulled her .22 out on him as well. He attempted to retrieve his weapon from a cereal box once Lovey was gone, but Aries let him know she is always 10 steps ahead of him. Once Aries was gone, Saint went to talk to Crow. Come to find out, Crow stated that he didn't remember Saint bringing Aries in last night, which made Saint's blood boil to know that Aries had caught him slipping, and the fact that she got past Crow. At that moment, Saint did not want Crow to know that he was sweating bullets on the inside. However, he let it be known that he no longer needed Crow as his personal security. Later, Aries went to the sheriff's station to speak with Sheriff Gibson. He is a tall, bald, brown-skinned man with a salt and pepper beard. He has known Aries since she was a baby and also knew her dad and uncles. So he, as well as the entire island, had no problem protecting and hiding Aries out once she returned to the island. After Aries came into the station, she asked Sheriff about Saint, wondering where did he come from and how did he slip through the cracks without doing his homework. The sheriff didn't know much about it, but he just knew that dude had come in a few months ago and bought the teen club. He explained to Aries that he really doesn't get too involved because so many come through, set up shop, and grab a bankroll. And he just collects his cut every month to turn the other way. So he figured that's what Saint was doing too. Aries let it be known she did not like him coming through, messing with her, and if he didn't stop, things could get messy. The sheriff told her to basically calm down because she didn't need to draw any attention to herself, and that he would look into Saint. Later, the sheriff asked Aries what time does Flower make it to her restaurant in the mornings. Aries told him usually around 10, and the sheriff told Aries that Flower leaves the station around 8 a.m. And he was concerned about knuckleheads who be running around and if they are bothering Flower. Chapter 5, Saint and Crow sat with Saint and a middle-aged white man who is actually Saint's accountant, counting cash inside a wave in Saint's office while the club was closed. The accountant was basically counting out $75,000 in cash and packing it into his briefcase, and then writing Saint a check for $50,000. Saint was basically washing his money through anonymous investors. The accountant told him he needed to find a different way to wash his money because the investors were feeling uneasy, and the small club Saint ran could only make so much money without the feds getting involved. He told Saint he needed to find an established business with a lot of traffic that takes cash payment. After the accountant left, Saint told Crow he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing in Wave. Crow, of course, played dumb. That's when Saint got in Crow's face and told him to stop selling pills in that club. The whole purpose of opening the teen spot was to be able to stay under the radar. He told Crow to keep the pills on the block. Although Crow acknowledged, Saint kind of seemed like he was getting aggravated. Saint told himself to keep an eye on Crow because it seemed like he was getting out of control. Later in the chapter, Aries went to a bar called Jimmy's where she met a waitress by the name of Red who was clearly flirting with her. Although Aries claimed she wasn't gay, she found Red very attractive with a nice body, large boobs, and a nice butt. They chit-chatted and flirted a bit telling each other how pretty they were. Aries found out that Red just came to the island because when she was younger, her and her mother traveled there via a cruise. So she found a job opening and just came. And she was currently an aspiring writer who is working on an island thriller about a serial killer and a relentless cop. Somewhere along the way, Aries was turned on by Red and had thoughts of putting her rose toy to use once she got home, but chalked the feelings up to the ganja she was smoking. The next part of the chapter takes place basically in the slums of Bridgetown, where tourists as well as locals go for drugs and prostitute. The area that is not shown on brochures or commercials. On this day, pills were selling, teens and tourists were on the move. Crow and his crew was getting to the money. Crow was glad he no longer had to sleep on Saint's porch. He felt a sense of resentment because although he was Saint's lieutenant and right-hand man, Saint had reduced him to a guard dog. Crow was ready to break away from Saint, and currently Saint was playing the back while Crow was the face of the operation. Anyway, this particular night at the trap, they had a mini block party for a minute, and then it was back to business. Crow saw Chubbs getting to the money, then started conversing, and Chubbs started talking about all the sexy ladies around, but everyone knew none of the girls would ever give him a chance, so he had to settle for the bottom of the barrel and prostitutes. So Crow made a joke about him not ever being able to get with none of the sexy girls, and the whole crew started laughing at Chubbs. After a while, Flower walks through, observing the atmosphere, and Chubb spot her because no one else is paying her any attention. Chubb cuts her off, tells her how pretty she is, and tries to manipulate her into doing what he wants for his own personal gain. He tries to lure her with his chain and tells her if she follows him to an abandoned house, she could wear it. Next thing you know, she is wearing the chain and on the side of the abandoned house, down on her knees, facing Chubb's genital area. Next, he tries to manipulate her by saying they will be best friends and that she will be able to come hang with him inside the party if she gives him fellatio, and told her it's like sucking her thumb. However, Flower keeps turning away. Meanwhile, back at the trap house, Saint has come through to collect his money. Crow leads him to the back where Jupe lets them in because the only people allowed in the back is Crow and Jupe. Jupe is barely 12 years old. Saint asks Crow about the islanders from the next town over, Trail's crew, who are trying to move in on their territory by the dock to try to cash in on some of the tourist money. Crow tells Saint they handle those dudes, and Saint asks him why are they banging with the goons when they need to be taken out the head. Long story short, Saint put out a hit on the leader via the murder of the Crows. While collecting the stash, Saint saw the jealousy Crow had and made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Once Saint left the trap while driving down the road, he spotted Chubbs and Flower outside of an abandoned house. Saint snuck up behind Chubbs while he was in the midst of getting aggressive with Flower and popped him on the back of the head, and then helped Flower up, dusted her off, then kicked Chubbs in the face. Took the chain off Flower and threw it on Chubbs, who was asleep face down and ass out, then proceeded to assist Flower to his car. Chapter 6, Aries was sitting at home, burning sage and smoking weed. Trey was sitting with her because she decided to close the restaurant for a couple of days due to the conditions Crow and his goons left it in. Trey was on his laptop, and somehow Aries asked him had he been with the girl yet, and that he needed to make sure he wrapped it up. Later, there was a knock at the back door, and it was a white man needing her signature because they were done setting up the new furniture in her restaurant. Saint had upgraded her restaurant, and she loved the new look. After she came back inside, there was a knock at the front door, which happened to be Saint and Flower. Of course, Aries was was shocked to see them together. Saint explained that he found her down in the bottom with people she didn't need to be around. For that, Aries was grateful and saw another side of Saint. They discussed the upgrade to her restaurant, which was basically an apology on Saint's part because he didn't tell Crow to go that far. Aries told Saint if he did that again, she knows where he lives, and next time she would send Crow back to him in a box. Saint was also eager to know how did Aries get past Crow that night when she came to his house. And of course, Aries only told him she has her ways. Saint also asked Aries out on a date. She declined at first and then realized she was attracted to him. Then told him she would be at Jimmy's later that night. Saint made it to the spot with the goons in tow before Aries arrived, so he sat at the bar and had drinks until she showed up. And when she did, she was dressed to impress. They eventually got a table. Soon thereafter, Red came to take their order and was of course infatuated by Aries to the point they were literally flirting with one another and getting turned on. Red ultimately offered a threesome or a 2-for-1. Either way, Saint couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Once Red family went to place the order, Saint and Aries were able to chop some things up. One was that she doesn't swing that route with girls, even though she was getting hot and bothered by Red. Then she wanted to know what Saint wanted from her. Saint revealed that he knew who she really was. He did his research and discovered documentaries about her and her crew. They both realized that they basically were on the same page and just wanted to be ghosts. After getting more acquainted, Aries let Saint know she didn't like Crow and was uncomfortable with him constantly watching her inside the club. So they decided to slip out and ended up being chauffeured around the island on the back of Saint's pickup truck while sipping wine. It was a pastime that Aries remembered sharing with her dad as a child, and Saint made it happen. Chapter 7, while Aries was out doing her thing, Trey was down at the trap with Jalen and the Crows in the midst of drug deals and prostitution. Somehow Jalen and Trey ended up on the conversation around vagina, and Jalen discovers that Trey is still a virgin. So one of his goons paid a prostitute named Sparkle to make Trey a man. So he ended up getting his first blowjob from her. Meanwhile, Aries and Saint continued their date on the back of the truck, talking and drinking wine, smoking ganja. They had all types of conversation and realized how much they enjoyed one another. Back at the bar, Crow got tired of waiting on Saint and decided to go back to the trap house. Once he got there, he noticed everyone was clapping and cheering on Trey, who had just emerged from the back with Sparkle. Jalen explained to Crow what had just went down. So thereafter, Crow commenced to apologize to Trey for what happened at his mom's restaurant, and then he gave Trey $500, and Trey was super excited. Anyway, when Saint and Aries made it back to the bar parking lot to end their date, Aries noticed Red sitting at the back door of the bar staring at them. Aries expressed to Saint that she thought Red was fed. He then told her he thought that Red just had a crush on her and wanted her real bad. Aries once again let him know that she didn't swing that route, but come to find out, she had dreamed about it a few times. Right before Saint ended the date, he tried to give Aries a kiss, but she brushed him off. He also offered to give her a ride home, which she also declined. Soon thereafter, Saint was gone and Aries was heading back into the bar when Red stopped her before she made it in. She started off by asking about the date, and from there, the girls were flirting and somehow ended up behind the bar tongue kissing that led to a sexual encounter, all while Saint was off in the cut watching the whole thing from a distance because he circled back around to make sure Aries made it home safe. Once the girls were done, Aries went home, but somehow Red and Saint made eye contact. Chapter 8, Aries made it home in the wee hours of the morning, smelling like Red and still thinking about their rendezvous. Once inside, she smelled smoke and thought her son was asleep and something was burning. Instead, there was an intruder, George Diaz, broke in to ultimately murk Aries and her son because her son had stole from him. Turns out the white boy that Crow beat up and robbed was Diaz's nephew. Of course, Aries didn't believe him until a goon brought Trey downstairs and he basically confessed that Crow made him do it. Aries knew that if Crow had anything to do with it, it was bad news. Diaz also explained that he paid a hacker good money to trace the money, and it led him right to Trey. Aries tried offering to pay Diaz back, but he refused. He wanted her to wash money for his fentanyl drug distribution. Of course, Aries refused, then brought up the fact that she was a remaining member, but then he brought up the fact that he knew that she was a remaining member of the Murder Mamas who was on the FBI's most wanted list back home. So she sent Trey upstairs, who was now looking confused, and got more details from Diaz as to what she would be doing, and found out that 20% would be her cut. All in all, Aries knew she had just made a deal with the devil. Now, chapter 9, Sheriff Gibson came into work like any other morning. He checked on Flower, who was in her cell with her bed made almost military style. He told her that he had ordered them breakfast. On his way back to his desk, he noticed the file cabinet that he kept track of all the money launderers on the island who paid him a cut to keep quiet. He went to check the back room to see if anything was taken, and he also noticed the back door had been pried open. Nothing had been taken. His next thought was Flower, and if somebody broke in to get to her. He asked her if anyone messed with her, and she shook her head no. She also shook her head yes when he asked her, did someone break in last night? A few minutes later, 2 federal agents came in by the name of Detective Watson and his partner, Detective Vasquez. They began by trying to blackmail him with his gambling habits because he had banked over $2 million within a 10-year period, and they had photos and surveillance of him buying large amounts of chips that he would then cash out and request his money in a check, basically washing the money he was being paid from the non-natives. They basically wanted him to turn over Aries in exchange for not going to jail for tax evasion. Of course, Sheriff Gibson played dumb as if he didn't know Aries. However, the FBI agents didn't believe him because they told him they have had an undercover agent in the area for a while, and the agent has confirmed Aries is on the island alive and well. The agents eventually left after the sheriff kept denying everything. They also left their car with him. However, Gibson had no intention of ever turning Aries in because he knew he would be making his own bed. But he also knew that he needed to get to Aries to tell her about the agents and the mold. He felt like Jimmy's bar made them susceptible to infiltration because Jimmy always hired outsiders and foreigners. Chapter 10, Aries woke up to her living room full of roses from Saint, of course. Later that morning, Sheriff Gibson came over with Flower. He claimed Flower wouldn't let him come along. The sheriff told Aries about the FBI looking for her. He failed to mention anything about the undercover agent who was planted on the island. He also told Aries that he didn't say anything because she was a native and they take care of their own. However, he reminded her that they had an expatriation treaty in place, so it wasn't much they really could do. Aries was caught off guard, but she had thought about Mia Moore just getting released due to Carisha-19. Anyway, the whole conversation was held in front of Flower as she sat down in the middle of the floor sniffing the roses. On the other part of this chapter, Saint went to do business with Jimmy from the bar that he met Aries at the other night. Somehow he convinced Jimmy to allow him to serve pills out of the establishment, gave him $50,000 up front, and offered him 20% of the proceeds. Of course, Crow and the goons were posted up around the facility while the meeting between Jimmy and Saint was being held privately in Jimmy's office. Saint had seen Red when he was headed to the back for the meeting. He reminisced on the encounter that he had witnessed between her and Aries that night. So after the meeting was done, he found her out back. He was trying to gain allyship while Red was flirting, and then they both began flirting. Red once again brought up the book she was writing and that she would be heading to New York soon. She also made it clear that she was bisexual. Saint was aroused by her and had thoughts of having a threesome with her and Aries, but he kept it cool and realized that was just a fantasy. When Red went back inside to work, Saint decided to take a piss on the side of a dumpster. Next thing you know, he was being kidnapped by two white guys dressed in all black with ski masks on. They ended up throwing him in a car with Diaz, who basically just wanted to team up with Saint on the drug distribution tip. However, they wanted to introduce Saint to fentanyl and had a facility that could make the pills and mix them with the fentanyl. He also had scientists and pharmacists on deck. He told Saint that it only cost them two cents to make, where Saint was spending about $2 a pill without fentanyl in it. He told Saint to sleep on it and maybe they could meet for breakfast on behalf of Saint's grandma, all while he was pulling up in front of Saint's house to drop him off. Saint took it as a threat. Once he got out of the vehicle, Crow and his goons pulled up, running up looking confused, and Saint just shut the front door in Crow's face. And of course, Crow took it as disrespect. Chapter 11. Sheriff Gibson came into work sipping his coffee like every other morning, and he noticed that Flower still wasn't back yet. She had been gone a week, and it had been 2 weeks since the FBI had visited him. He made it his business to go look for Flower if she wasn't back that day. He also remembered that she would do that from time to time. Next thing he knew, the FBI agents were back, but this time it was 3 of them: Vasquez, Watson, and Wade, aka Flower. It was at that moment that Sheriff Gibson had realized Flower had played him. She wasn't mentally challenged, mute, or a little girl. She was a professional FBI agent with a master's degree in psychology. She was also the daughter of 2 police officers. She was the lead agent in charge of infiltrating the island's criminal enterprise. Her name was Melissa Wade, and hearing this information shocked the sheriff. He felt the ultimate betrayal, and it sent him into cardiac arrest and eventually to the upper room. Detective Wade did shed a tear as she witnessed his life leave his body. The other half of this chapter takes place at an old souvenir shop turned into a makeshift office for the FBI agents. There were no other running businesses in the area. It was secluded, boarded up, windows were tinted, and the only exit was in the back. The place had been remodeled for them to that of a condo with a shower and all. The agents had been staked out in it for months, building their case. They came to the conclusion that they needed to take down Saint because they knew that he was getting drugs to America through the dock, where tourists were always in and out. However, they really had nothing on Saint. He basically kept his hands clean. So they discovered that in order to take down Saint, they would have to go through his right-hand man, Crow. They then focused on Aries, pictured on the bulletin board they had up with every criminal involved, including all of their hotspots. And then to Mia Moore, they were saying that Aries and Mia Moore were like sisters and definitely partners in crime, and spoke on Mia Moore marrying Carter Jones and became the queen of the cartel. When they brought up Carter's name, they seemed a little spooked, and Detective Wade insinuated that she didn't believe Carter was dead because she had yet to see him on a coroner's table, nor had she seen his casket get dropped into the dirt. Later, they heard the parade being held for Sheriff Gibson, and Detective Wade shedded a tear and had to leave the room. Chapter 12. It was the day of Sheriff Gibson's funeral, and Aries, Saint, Trey, and Lovey were all back at Saint's house in their funeral attire. Of course, Aries felt the way because she couldn't see Gibson off properly, and the fact that he was all she had left of her childhood. Lovey took Trey to the kitchen for dessert while Saint and Aries talked. She told him that there was a lot going on around her life, but didn't quite go into detail That's when Saint suggested they go to his secret spot he had off in the cut for a couple of days. And of course, Aries refused because she didn't want to leave Trey alone. That's when Saint suggested he stay with Lovey. That's when Aries agreed to escape with Saint for a couple of days. Later in the chapter, Saint and Aries head to Saint's secret hideaway that was on the outskirts of the island. They traveled there in Saint's truck, and then once they got to the beautiful rainforest, they had to take a small boat to the hut that floated on the water. Saint told Aries he had bought the spot about 5 years ago and that no one knew about it, not even his grandma. Aries described the inside as white clouds because of all of the white pillows everywhere. He made her give up her phone because the space was used to unplug from the noise. Eventually, Aries went to the back to change into a sheer cover-up, revealing her naked body so that she could truly relax. However, Saint was aroused. While Aries was changing, 2 old ladies on a boat brought Saint some food and a backpack full of pills, and he gave them a bag full of money. He said they were his connects, caterers. Aries never witnessed any of this. She asked about a bathroom when she returned from the back, and he explained that there wasn't one, and she would have to use nature. At first, she thought it was gross, but soon she was derobing and jumping in the lake after Saint. After Saint finally got in the water, one thing led to another, and then suddenly they were on the deck getting it on. This went on throughout the rest of the day. Chapter 13 took place at the trap house. Trey was sitting on the couch with Jalen smoking weed, and over the last few months, Trey had picked up some habits and was becoming more comfortable in this setting. The Crows was there as well, rolling dice and making sales. The girls were in the midst of doing what they do. After a while, Sparkle started dancing to the music at Jalen's request. The Crows and their girls were cheering her on, throwing money on her. Some of the girls joined in with the twerking. Sparkle kept locking eyes with Trey because they had been messing around, and she was starting to like him. She saw how his confidence had grown, and she felt good that she had something to do with it all. Meanwhile, Chubbs had taken out some 20s to throw on her, just as Crow entered the room, and he was disgusted at the sight of everyone having fun. He was bipolar, and today his mood was triggered because he was having a bad day. Anyway, he pulled the plug on the music and took out his frustration on Chubbs. He already had an issue with Chubb based on the info Saint told him he had tried to do with Flower. So he yelled at Chubbs and told him he needed to be trying to make money instead of trying to waste it on girls. But when Chubbs tried to explain himself, Crow spit on him and then slapped him. Of course, the crowd started laughing, and eventually Chubbs left because he was embarrassed, and he vowed that he would never return to the trap. After that, Crow had Jalen meet him upstairs in the money room, the office where Juke was. Once they were in the office, Crow told Jalen he wanted him to earn his stripes by handling some dudes that were trying to move in on their turf. He told him he needed him to go with Juke to handle the dudes because they needed new faces to sneak up on these dudes. Jalen, of course, was down because he had been waiting for this moment. While this secret meeting was taking place, Saint entered the office and was furious because the rule was no one was to be in that room but Crow and Juke. So Saint came in asking about Jalen being in there. Crow responded that that was his little brother, but Saint wasn't trying to hear none of that. He went on to dap up Juke because he knew Juke didn't have anything to do with what Crow had going on. Also, Juke was Saint's protege and a boss in the making. Crow eventually told Jalen to leave, and then Saint locked the door behind him and proceeded to ask about the money for that day. While handing Juke the Dofa bag to fill, Crow responded that everything was good, but he made a suggestion that their operation needed to be shut down and that they needed to move the soldiers down to the warehouse with Diaz. Saint didn't like what Crow was saying and reminded him that their operation is what got them this far, and if they put everything in Diaz's hands, that he could snatch it all from underneath them at any given moment. But in Crow's mind, he saw Diaz as a way to make it to the top in the drug world. He told Saint that he wasn't making smart moves since he had been with Aries. Saint told him to watch his mouth and remember where he came from. Of course, Crow's ego was bruised and he was planning his next exit strategy. Saint saw the look in Crow's eyes and he knew that betrayal would be coming soon and started planning his next chess move. Saint was really over this hustling life. Chapter 14 was at the new resort that Diaz had been renovating. Him and his daughter, Christina, were walking through, admiring how things had come together. He named the resort after his one and only child, which is Christina. And she had just received her bachelor's in business administration. He was telling her how proud he was of her and how she was going to be a great general manager at the resort. It was the day of the grand opening. They had been renovating it for months, and this resort would be the headquarters for his criminal enterprise. He also bought an automotive plant that he turned into a drug manufacturing plant and disguised it as a toilet tissue factory. As they continued to walk, a group of men were heading their way, being led by a white guy with a clipboard. He was head of security, and the men that he was showing around were the Crows, Crow being the ringleader. Saint thought it would be a good idea for them to be security and valet so that they would have an inside edge on the resort. The guy with the clipboard name was Tom, and him and Diaz stepped aside to discuss some things, and Christina and Crow started making eye contact. Christina had a fetish for black men, and Crow's distinctive look intrigued her. She was eager to have a piece of Crow. Ultimately, they signaled to each other to meet at the pool area. Soon after, her father was leading her away, and all she could think about was getting to that pool area. The other half of the chapter, Aries got a call from Mia Moore, who was still in prison. Mia Moore used code names to refer to Aries. They started off by saying how much they really missed each other, and Mia Moore spoke on how she was ready to get out of prison. She also spoke about how Aries had been missing her calls and asked her was it because of a new dude. She stated that she would be home in a month because of a bill Trump passed and had no intentions of returning to the slammer. The conversation went on into how she missed her son and how he looks just like his dad. Aries told Mia Moore she wanted Trey to spend a summer with CJ and basically said Trey was a weenie. Little did they know Trey was listening, and he felt some kind of way hearing his mom say that about him. So he left and was angry, but was going to make it his business to prove to his mom that he wasn't soft. Meanwhile, Detective Wade and her team were parked outside of Diaz's resort, sitting in a flower delivery truck. The truck was a makeshift FBI hub filled with surveillance monitors because they had just as many cameras and microphones installed inside the resort as Diaz did. They infiltrated Diaz's staff and had undercovers working as construction workers. Come to find out, Diaz was wanted back in the States too, and Wade was building the case on them all, including Saint. The agents all sat watching the monitors and noticed something going on camera 5 that was installed by the pool, and they zoomed in and noticed Crow on the screen looking suspicious. Soon thereafter, Christina appeared and the both of them went into a utility closet. In the closet, Christina gave Crow fellatio, and ultimately Christina wanted more because she was a nympho with a fetish for black men, although she was engaged. Crow told her he had other things to do and she could meet him at Jimmy's on Friday if she wanted to be pounded. Crow was used to tourists coming to the island in search of black men to have a rendezvous with, so this was nothing new to him. Anyway, he left Christina stuck on thirsty. Back at Saint's house on the water, he and Aries lay on pillows smoking weed and talking. They both spoke about having enough money to leave it all behind and disappear, but because Diaz had them both by the balls, it wasn't much they could do without causing an uproar. Aries had to lay low and comply because of her son. Then Aries told Saint that Crow had been back to her restaurant and had told her she needed to break things off with Saint. Saint wanted to know why Crow was doing all that, and he knew Crow had gone too far. He knew it was time to cut him off before things got worse. Anyway, they began talking about plans for Aries' birthday. She was to meet Saint by the shore just before the sun set. Aries was falling in love with Saint and she admired him, but she was keeping something from him. She had recently found out she was pregnant, and although she knew Saint would make a great father, she didn't want her past to catch up to her and end up giving birth in prison. So she was contemplating abortion for that reason. However, she would decide on telling Saint or not by a week's end. She also knew Mia Moore was finally out and could help her with that decision. Chapter 15, back at the warehouse, Crow and his crew was watching the mounds of fentanyl and various powdered pharmaceuticals being formed into pill form via shirtless workers with face masks, gloves, and machines. Crow noticed how business had started booming since they linked with Diaz. Everything was expanding and going as planned. Crow was acting as an overseer, making sure no one was trying to steal, and had his goons posted as they waited for a signal. Crow also noticed Louis, Diaz's nephew, who was sitting playing on his phone and was oblivious as to what was going on. Crow was disgusted that this sloppy dude was granted so much power and clearly didn't deserve it. Meanwhile, Diaz had slipped in with his bodyguards, and that's when Louis quickly put away his phone and went to meet his uncle. He wanted to give the illusion that he was in charge. Diaz told his nephew they needed a large order by Sunday and wanted to know how much they could have produced by then, and of course Louis didn't know, but Crow stepped in and answered. Diaz noticed that Crow was confident and knowledgeable and felt like he was in charge of keeping things afloat in the factory. Diaz asked about Saint and when was the last time he had been around, and Crow told him it had been weeks and that Saint was spending all his time with Aries. Diaz then asked Crow to show him around the facility. Diaz told Crow that he knew his nephew wasn't any help, but he had promised his late brother that he would take care of him and make sure he wasn't out doing anything stupid. Crow and Diaz walked throughout the warehouse, and Crow explained every detail of the operation. Eventually, Diaz asked Crow if he could run the operation without Saint. Crow wasn't sure if he was being tested, but soon thereafter, he answered that he could run it because it all comes natural for him. Diaz then asked Crow what exactly does Saint do, and Crow didn't say anything, just gave Diaz a gaze, and that was all Diaz needed to see to get the answer, which translated that Crow was the real head honcho in charge. And with that, Diaz knew that he needed to mold Crow into a street version of a politician so that he could become a successful trafficker. And it was a plus that Crow was a native. The two of them planned to meet up on Friday and that Diaz could pick him up on the block. On Aries' birthday, Saint led her to the shore blindfolded, and she was wearing a white dress and no panties, as Saint had instructed. Saint was wearing white too. Once he guided her down to the sand, he removed the blindfold. However, Aries was expecting a nice dinner, but what she saw was rose petals everywhere, a massage table, and two butt-naked women massaging each other, and then realized after a minute that one of them was actually red and the other one was a Latina girl. Let's just say that the evening was filled with lots of pleasure for Aries and Saint during that entanglement. Meanwhile, Crow and Christina was on the other side of town getting to business. He loved the fact that he was pounding out a privileged and spoiled brat that happened to be the plug's daughter. Chubb was creeping up on Crow with a gun in hand. He had went missing for a while planning this very attack, but when Chubb cocked his gun, it alerted Crow, who then snatched his gun off his belt and started firing before Chubbs let out his first shot. However, he did eventually return fire, spitting bullets like a machine gun. Crow ended up grabbing Christina and used her as a human shield, so her body caught all the smoke and she died immediately. Crow returned fire to Chubb, sending him flying on his back. He walked over and put two more in Chubb's head. The music from the bar had drowned out all of the commotion going on. Crow then walked toward Christina and realized she was gone. Crow yelled out because he knew what would come next, so he headed to the trap. Chapter 16. Crow had been laying low at the trap since everything had transpired. The town was in a frenzy since the death of Christina. Crow had also declined the job at the resort as security. He had vowed to keep the secret of what really happened and take it to the grave. It had been weeks since the altercation, but no one had any answers. Anyway, later, Saint pulled up to the trap, and he and Crow went into the money room office where Juke was, and that's when Saint began asking Crow what happened. Of course, Crow played dumb, talking about he didn't know. Saint said that he heard that all the Crows was at the club that night. Crow replied with he left early because he had some skins to get in. Then Saint mentioned Chubb's body being found on the scene and asked Crow about the smoke they had. Crow said that Chubbs got out of line and he just roughed him up, but hadn't seen him since then. Saint knew Crow was telling a pack of lies. He told Crow that Diaz had called him 32 times and that they needed to get to the bottom of it. Crow told him he had him, but Saint saw the deceit in Crow's eyes. He knew Crow was hiding something. Eventually, Saint told him that he was done with this hustling ish, and once they got it all figured out, he would be retiring. Crow wasn't trying to hear none of that, because with Saint leaving, he would lose his plug, being that he wasn't sure how things would work out with Diaz at this point. That's when he decided to fix his mouth to tell Saint that he needed to leave Aries alone because she had him moving sloppy. Saint told him to watch his mouth. Crow put his hand on his waistline and bucked up to Saint. That's when Jupe had a snub nose to the back of Crow's head and took his weapon. Saint gave Jupe his weapon as well, and they commenced to whooping Crow's butt and then choked him up. Saint told Crow never disrespect him again unless he would be headed to the upper room. After that, Saint and Jupe left and had cleared the money. They had cleared the money out earlier. Aries had just closed her restaurant for that day and realized she had not received her first of the month payment from Diaz. Since they had started doing business, he had never been late, and she found it odd that this month he was. Aries hadn't heard about his daughter passing yet though. Meanwhile, Trey came in and was walking past his mom without speaking, and she asked him what was up. She could smell the weed and could see his eyes. He responded to her dryly, saying he was just doing him. Aries felt some kind of way because their bond used to be close, and now he wasn't letting her in. She told him it wasn't like him to be smoking weed, and he responded sarcastically, like, yeah, right, cause I'm a softie. Then he walked away. Aries knew in that moment that Trey had heard her talking to Mia more. She made a mental note to apologize later. Chapter 17. Diaz was at the coroner's office to examine his daughter for the last time. He felt like she didn't look like herself because her head was swollen and her lips were purple. Eventually, the coroner pulled the sheet over Christina so that Diaz wouldn't have to suffer any longer. Diaz was heading out and thinking at the same time that he needed answers before things got violent. As he was headed to his sprinter, escorted by his goons, Crow came out of nowhere asking to speak with Diaz. He claimed to know what happened to Christina. After a minute, Diaz signaled his goons to allow Crow to speak. So they threw him in the vehicle, and Crow ultimately told him that Saint had made the call to murk Chubbs, and Christina got caught up in the crossfire. That's when Diaz made a threat to take out Saint because he noticed that Saint hadn't been answering his calls. So with that, he believed Crow. He asked Crow, did Saint have kids, because he wanted Saint to feel the pain he was feeling. Crow told him no, but that Saint was in love with Aries, and of course Aries had a son. Diaz wanted Aries' son taken out so that they could feel his pain, and then he planned on handling them later. He told Crow to take out Trey, which was surprising to Crow because that wasn't a part of his concocted plan. However, he wanted power. So he asked Diaz if he made this happen, would he take Saint's spot? And Diaz simply nodded yes, and that's all Crow needed to hear. Back at Crow's house, he sat at a small table with Jalen, asking him if he wanted to be a part of the crew. Jalen was feeling some type of way because of what Crow was asking him to do. He questioned Crow as to why he wanted to take out Trey, and Crow blamed it on Saint. Then Jalen asked again about being a member of the Crows, something he had always wanted, and Crow confirmed by swearing on their mother. Later, Trey and Jalen were on the beach. Trey had snuck out because he was being rebellious against his mom. The Crows were also partying at the beach, and Trey and Jalen were drinking and celebrating Jalen's new MOC tattoo. and the fact that he was finally an official member of the Crows. After a while, the boys had a sentimental moment before they made a toast to being boys for life. Jalen then tried to convince Trey of going back to the house to hook up with Sparkle them. Trey declined at first because he didn't want to return home too late and be in trouble with Aries. But after Jalen told him that they were only going to be there for a hot minute to get some romance from the girls to celebrate his new affiliation to the Crows, Trey decided to go. Meanwhile, Aries was at home on the balcony talking to Millmore, who had just been released from prison. She told Millmore she was waiting on Trey to get back because he had snuck out, and she let him go so that he could enjoy a little freedom. Millmore told her how CJ was wilding out in the streets just like his dad and uncles used to. Millmore also claimed that she was going to get him back on track though, but after she got back in tune with everything. Eventually, Millmore asked Aries did she keep the appointment. Aries said yes, but she still was going back and forth about it because she still hadn't told Saint about the pregnancy because she felt like he would want to keep it. But that would make their bond permanent. And the way her life was going right now, she needed to be able to pick up and go at any time. Then Millmore asked her if she loved him. And Aries responded with, what love got to do with it? The other part of the chapter, Crow had called Saint and requested for them to meet up, and now they were sitting face to face at a table, and Saint had his Glock in his hand under the table as Crow was sitting there pleading and apologizing while explaining why he was being so disrespectful towards Saint, all while crying crocodile tears. Saint was confused on how to take Crow because Crow wasn't wrapped too tight. Eventually, both men stood up, but Saint had his gun drawn because he didn't know what to expect from Crow. But Crow was still crying and fell into Saint's arms, sobbing into his chest, all while reaching for his small gun he had tucked in his waist. Saint was busy contemplating whether Crow was serious or not, and in that moment, Crow ended up popping Saint in the chest twice. Saint ended up flying to the floor, and his gun flew out of his hand. Crow stood over Saint watching him hold his chest, and he thought about how Saint had beat and choked him, and he wanted to send one to Saint's head but heard someone coming down the stairs and decided to flee instead. In his mind, his plan was coming together as expected. Meanwhile, Aries decided to go to Jimmy's. It was around 2 a.m. on a weekday, so she knew it would be fairly empty, and give her a minute to clear her head with the weight of the abortion, the feds, and her disconnect with her son all on her shoulders. She sat in a corner and smoked her ganja, then soon thereafter made eye contact with Red and smiled at her. And Red winked back in return. And just when Red was about to head over to Aries, another waitress burst in the door, and Red ran directly to Red and apparently gave Red some bad news. Red eventually made her way to Aries to relay the message about her son being found inside of a house with a slug to the head. Of course, Aries broke down because she couldn't believe what she had just heard. What had happened an hour prior, Jalen lured Trey back to the house and all the lights were out. Trey began to ask Jalen what was going on because the girls were nowhere in sight. Jalen told Trey to check in the back room, and Trey walked to the back confused, but Jalen was right behind him. Trey turned the light on to the room and noticed plastic spread across the floor. He then turned around to ask Jalen what was going on, but when he turned around, Jalen had the blicky pointed at Trey's head. Trey told him to stop playing with that because it was dangerous. Jalen told Trey to close his eyes and it wouldn't hurt. Trey was getting scared, trembling, and heart racing, telling Jalen he thought they were homies. And Jalen was full of guilt and shame as well, but being down with the Crows was more important to him. Next thing you know, Jalen popped Trey dead in the forehead. He was so shook he dropped the blicky and watched his friend transition. He was sad, but now he was finally a Crow and he had just passed initiation. Anyway, back to Saint. Saint sat up and watched Crow run out the back door. Juke came downstairs with his heater drawn and asked Saint, was he okay? Saint revealed that he had on a vest, and he opened his shirt and it exposed the 2 holes and the heat coming from them, from the bullets Crow released. Juke apologized for not making it downstairs in time, and Saint told him he did what he was supposed to do, and that was to protect Lovey. Either way, they knew in that moment there was a full-on war erupting. Now this is chapter 18, the final chapter. It was the day of Trey's secret homegoing ceremony that Aries had planned. Mia Moore and CJ were on both sides of Aries as they stood over the grave that the gravesite worker had begun tossing dirt in. CJ suggested that they leave because Aries didn't need to see anymore. They eventually got into their SUV and had 2 SUVs following them, which were CJ's goons that he had brought from Miami. Saint was trying to call Aries, but she declined the call because she decided to disconnect from anyone associated with the island. After a while, CJ told Aries that they had found out who pulled the trigger on her child. Aries wanted to be taken to them. All Aries saw was red, and she was back to her old self. Saint had been trying to contact his girl for over a week to no avail. He had heard about Trey and was devastated, but he couldn't understand why Aries cut him off. The only thing he knew is that Trey had last been seen with Jalen and figured that Crow had something to do with it. He headed for the trap to get some answers, but when he got over there, no one was in sight and the block looked like a ghost town. And then he saw the unthinkable. CJ ended up parking behind Aries Manufacturing Company, and the goons followed suit. CJ had pulled over so that he could reveal to Aries who was in the trunk of one of the goons' cars. He told her that they found out that Trey was last seen with Jalen. Jalen had a crow tattoo that led them to the Crows, and when CJ popped the trunk, there was Crow, bloody, beaten, bound, and gagged. They left him alive to allow him to tell Aries what he had told them. Of course, Crow decided to blame everything on Saint because he thought Saint was murked. And plus, Aries made him talk because she was sending shots to his crotch. Crow explained to Aries that Diaz told Saint to take out Trey, and that if he didn't, then he would eliminate Saint. He wanted Saint to feel the same pain he felt after losing his daughter because Saint made the call on Chubbs, and Diaz's daughter got caught in the crossfire. Aries didn't want to hear anymore. She just told CJ that she wanted his head cut off slowly. Not sure if she was speaking of Crow or Saint. Now that's me talking. I'm not sure if she was speaking of Crow or Saint, whoever head she wanted cut off slowly. But CJ said cool and closed the trunk. After that, CJ took them to the trap so that Aries could see the work that CJ and his goons had put in, cartel style. They had bodies of the Crows lynched from light poles down an entire block, and Jalen was one of them. As they were riding through, they crossed paths with Saint, but he couldn't see who was in the SUV because the windows were tinted. But Aries saw him, and CJ knew who he was due to his investigation. However, Aries stopped him from doing anything right then and there, but told CJ she wanted Saint's entire household head on platters. Mia Moore told her that maybe she should reschedule that abortion, and Aries said no, she wanted that man's baby out of her. Saint wakes up to the smell of burning breakfast, but thinks it's normal for his grandma to burn food up while being consumed by her favorite TV shows. But as he makes his way to the kitchen after calling her a couple of times with no response, he notices a lot of smoke. Food is burning and the smoke detector is beeping, and his grandma is nowhere in sight. After putting the burning pots in the sink and running water over them, Saint discovers that he has stepped into something wet and finds out it's actually blood. Then he finds his grandma's headless body. Shaken and shook, he calls out for his personal gunman, Jupe, and goes to look for him and finds his headless body in the living room. After a few moments, he discovers both his grandma's and Jupe's head on platters in the china cabinet and realizes this was his karma. Back at Aries' house, there was a knock at the door. Aries grabbed her fire. CJ followed her lead, but when Aries looked through the peephole, she saw Flower and quickly let her guard down and let her in. Flower was looking wild as usual, and CJ and Miramore were looking confused. Aries told them that Flower doesn't understand. She proceeded to hug Flower, told her she missed her and began preparing her food, all while still talking about how she hopes Saint passes out when he sees his grandma's head, and after he buries her, she planned on sending him right behind her. So yeah, guys, this is the end of the review. All I want to say is my thoughts about it. The book started off really slow, and it was like trying to get to know who these characters actually are. And like everybody in this particular book at the beginning was new except for Aries. And we really hadn't heard from Aries in a while, being that when she had her son, she kind of like faded out of the whole Cartel series. So it was interesting in the beginning and trying to follow along and understand the plot, you know what I'm saying, and all of these new characters. But once it really got going, it started to make sense as to what was going on. And I can say that the book ended on a note that will make you want to get book 2, the Cartel Queen 2, which I wasn't able to pre-order my copy, so I don't know when I will be able to get that book, but I will, you know, keep my ear to the street to see when they will have some more available. But yeah, guys, I think this was a good book. Like I said, I think that the next book, since we know all of these characters and everything like this from this particular book, I think it will be an easier read on the next one, and it can get straight to the action. We don't really have to get to know the characters, you know, it's just a full-on war at this point. So I'm hoping that, you know, it'll be a better read and more action-packed. So yeah, guys, let me know what you all thought about the book in the comments below. Let me know if you read the book. I do think that everyone should at least, you know, read this one so that you will be prepared for the next one when they come out with it. I do have a full book reading on my Patreon if you want to listen to that. Other than that, you know, you can order it from Amazon or you know, any of the bookstores. You just have to check first online and see where the books are being sold. So yeah, guys, yeah, so I do want to thank you all for stopping by and joining me in the reading room. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next one. Peace and love, and as always, be blissful.
DJ Mike C on the track.
Cause that be natural.
Lady
I ain't
D.
looking tacky. I keep my game tackled.
Yo,
Yeah, I'm so nappy. Cause that be natural.
The infamous.
I ain't looking tacky. Cause I keep my game tackled.
I'm so pretty, I'm so taboo, I'm so natural, it's like it's a taboo. I'm so filthy, got the tattoo, fucking these bitches like I own ragu. On my business with my platoon, getting these minutes like I'm a tapu. Y'all is cheering on that cartoon, and I'm sitting on top with these buffaloes. I'm so nappy, I'm so nappy. All these dudes that wanna get at me, I'm so cultured and I'm happy. Jealous witches wanna come back me, cause I'm comfortable in my skin. End of the day, you lose, I win. I'm so comfortable in my ends, don't care if I make or lose a few friends, and I look like $1 trillion. Lady D won a lotto, cause in the Lord I trust, and beauty is the motto. Naturally thick in the butt, I'm Billy Blanks on the top. Edges a little rough, just pretend I'm from a